The Turkish president has vowed to drown a U.S.-backed border security force in Syria. Lambasting Washington for what he called forming a terrorist force on Turkey's border, Recep Tayyip Erdogan said, "A country we call an ally is insisting on forming a terror army on our borders. What can that terror army target but Turkey?" On Sunday, the U.S.-led coalition said it was working with the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, to set up the new border force. Although the current friction between the U.S. and Turkey can be a serious development, some political observers argue that at the end of the day, the U.S. will be reluctant to give up its NATO ally in favor of a group of Kurdish fighters.
What we've seen from the Americans themselves, from people like Secretary of Defense James Mattis and several other officials, it doesn't seem like the Americans are very committed to a Kurdish state and are simply doing this to artificially prolong the war because they're trying to make it hard for the Syrian state to regain independence and rebuild its infrastructure after the war, which I think they already recognize is over in favor of the Syrian government that's in place right now. So Erdogan and Turkey siding on this side, I think, would bode very well for them. And I don't think that the Americans would go into an all-out war in favor of the Kurds.
Warning the U.S. and other nations over the stated plan, Erdogan said, "This is what we have to say to all our allies. Don't get in between us and terrorist organizations, or we will not be responsible for the unwanted consequences." The Turkish president has already shown to have no stable line of policy toward regional diplomacy. His complicated relations with Russia over the past few years is a case in point.
People look at Erdogan exactly for who he is and who he markets himself as, which is a Turkish nationalist, somebody pursuing a neo-Ottoman policy. And so they look at him as somebody that's not really ideologically committed to any grand vision of the region that doesn't put Turkey first. And so all he's doing right now is putting his country first. And what the Americans are doing, supporting the Kurds, to him at least, and I think there's some argument for that, it is a threat to Turkey's territorial integrity, because they have been brutally repressing Kurdish separatists in Turkey for quite a long time, which would be obviously exacerbated by a Kurdish state in Syria. And so he sees this as a threat. That's why he's now aligning with Russia, who, of course, he was nearly at the brink of war with in 2015 when the Turkish Air Force shot down a Russian jet, which was a pretty grave provocation. But they've managed to completely reverse this.
Geopolitically, Erdogan uses Turkey's relationship with Moscow as leverage against its European and NATO partners whenever the occasion arises. Criticizing Washington's refusal to extradite Fethullah Gulen, whom Turkey blames for the 2016 coup attempt, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu recently said that ties between the NATO allies could be harmed further if the U.S. does not correct its mistakes. Although the Gulen issue can add fuel to the fire, it's unlikely to determine the trajectory of relations between the U.S. and Turkey.
And they're certainly personal to Erdogan. I mean, him and Gulen had a deep relationship before their falling out, and the United States will not extradite Gulen, who he sees as instrumental in the failed coup attempt, of course. And that's personal, I think, a personal thing for Erdogan. But I think the more significant thing here is the geopolitics that's been going on in Syria, and the interrelations between Turkey and NATO and the United States, on a grander perspective that has actually pulled even more people than just Erdogan and the Turkish government into this. And so I think that's really what we should be focusing on.
The extradition of Gulen, Ankara's down payment for Russian S-400s, Washington's support for the Kurdish Syrian People's Protection Units, YPG, and the controversial case against the Turkish businessman Reza Zarrab are all signs of a declining relations between Washington and Ankara. As ties between Ankara and Moscow continue to blossom, the question is, have the Turkish-US relations outlived their usefulness?